haciendo.
We want
La
to thank the
participación de
participation of Quality Meat Scotland. Now we're going to continue with a very interesting presentation regarding consumer data of the meat trading of the final public. We want to remind you that this presentation from now on for the rest of the day will all be in Spanish. So therefore we recommend that you can have access to the room original language so you can hear all of the presentations spoken in Spanish. We know that everyone consumes food, and the other has to do with each retail. What is happening in Chile? For them, we have a very interesting presentation of Escudero, who is the director of the Meat Association at CHIC AG. He is a lawyer in every profession. He is a doctor of organizations in Navarra. He has a vast experience, very close to the public consumer. That is why we want to invite Mr. Gastón Escudero to give his presentation called Perspectives and Impact of the Post-Pandemic of the Way that We Eat Meat in Chile in the Supermarkets. Good morning. I thank you so much for Carne to participate in this event. My appreciation is divided into 3 blocks. The first one is to show the situation of consuming meat in Chile on the basis of the perspective of the meat basket. This is an expression I usually use, which consists of seeing eating meat in an integrated way. This is basically the bovine, sheep, and poultry. Here in this graph, I am showing the evolution of the meat baskets in the last 30 years. There are many things that we could talk about. I'm just going to make a couple of comments. The first, in 1990 up to this day, the consuming of meat has multiplied 2 to 3 times. This is an important consuming. It could be at the level of the developed countries. And within this meat basket, I want to highlight the situation of the beef meat, which is the red line, which is showing that the went from 20 kilos to practically 28 kilos per capita per year. In regards to the poultry meat, it's very small. The poultry meat has multiplied by 4. The pork, 2.5. I'm talking about consuming. I'm not talking about production. I'm talking about what we are consuming, which is given by the national production and the imports. But that's another subject. But the consuming has gone 2.5 times. The beef consuming has decreased in the meat basket. It was the highest in the 1990s, but today it is the 2nd place. In fact, just a few years, it got to be almost in the 3rd place after the poultry and after the pork. In the last 30 years, you can see that there was a decrease, a relative decrease of the beef consuming, even though it has increased, but it has increased less than the poultry. The poultry. You can see in this graph today, in 2020, the poultry consuming was 43%, the beef 31%, and the pork 26%. The second block is made up of some of the novelties that I have seen when it comes to selling in the retail. When Veronica was talking about that I am a meat producer, I am a butcher from second generation. I have meat stores, and this is the perspective where I do my presentation. I'm going to talk about two novelties that I was able to see in the last year and a half. One has to do with the pandemic, and the other has to do with the last 25 years that I've been there. I've never seen before is the scarcity of the national products. When we talk about the effects of the pandemic, I classify them into two. We have higher demands, and it has obligated us to develop these sales channels. When I talk about higher demands, all of the agriculture guilds have to do the prevention protocols, public attention, cleaning, etc. For instance, in the sales room, we had to put acrylics, which is separating us from the public. Also, the salesmen, as the public, have to use masks. This makes it very difficult for us to communicate. On the other hand, we have limits of how many people can be inside the room. Depends on, we cannot have more than 4, 6, 8 people in our sales room buying. The rest of the people have to wait outside, which also obligates us to have a person who is controlling the people who are coming into the sales room. All of this has generated a lot of upset in the public. So many times they don't understand. People come to buy quickly because they only have a permission of 2 hours. On the weekend, the public is using the only permit that they can have. They are not willing to wait that long. They are waiting for an hour to be attended. So this means that half of the time that they have available for shopping and to do what they need, their tasks, come back home. So all of these demands have obligated us to be very, very patient. But I can also say with the time the public has began to understand, because they understand that these demands has to do with their own security. Another data that I can mention, the increase of having to increase our expenses on cleaning with sanitations and cleaning. And at the same time, it's one of the most important expenses that we have in the butchery shops. All of this, I'm saying, I'm not complaining, but I'm just trying to show you a reality. The second point that I want to highlight is the development of the direct sales. For instance, in our company, a year ago, we began to sell online, sending it to their homes. Every once in a while, a very selective customer would ask us to send him to his house what he was asking for. But now it is part of our promotion. There is a person who is responsible for attending these kind of customers. And even though this channel isn't as much important as the physical stores, it has had I see people who are doing some petitions, not very encouraged, but they have been able to respond to these expectations. And now we can see that we have a good reception with our customers. Today, we have a database of customers around 800, 900 people. About a year and a half ago, we're not buying this way. Another thing is that they ask on email what they want. It is prepared, and then they go to the store just to take out, to receive what they're asking for and to pay. This is a very important modification of what we used to do before, because the customer would arrive at the store, would wait to be attended, and only then we would begin to prepare what he was asking for. But with this new way of working, it's reducing his time of waiting and also the time that he has to be outside of their home. And we, as a meat store, which makes us different from a supermarket, is the personalized attention. This was a big challenge because all of our competitive advantage had to do with this personalized attention, face-to-face between the salesman and the customer. But now the sales is being done by telephone, and in contrast with the salesman, is being reduced. So therefore, there is another aspect which is very specific, which is very, very important. And now it's not so much as the presence of the product in the shelf, the absence of odors, the cleaning. Not that we don't have to take care of them, but we need to incorporate them. Other elements that before we didn't have in our radar. This is a challenge, very pretty challenge. It obligates us to adapt ourselves to the new times. This issue, this novelty that I'm going to mention now, is very strange. This is being reflected on how expensive, when we talk about has had 50% cost of the beef products between June of last year and June of this year. 50% increase. It's too much. It's too much. I'm not complaining, but you cannot understand such a high increase. This also is being reflected on the scarcity of the cuts with bones. For instance, in this time, the same here, the shank, especially the shank of the leg, which we use a lot in the winter, has had a 40% increase, which is less than the bata. But when we talk about the thick ribs, has had a 60%, which is a cut which is being used to make a soup here, has had a 62%. This is a cost for us. We can see in what proportion do we transpose this cost to the public. It has not always been possible to transfer 100% of the increase to the customers. We are kind of like shock absorbers. When the product increases, we don't transfer the complete increase. The same thing happens when the cost drops to the customer. But however, we have seen something that is very curious, that in spite of the increase of the prices, the people have not decreased what they are consuming. The people have not decreased their consuming. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. The third block of my talk will be the perspective. What's going to happen in the short term. I'm going to talk about 3 different kinds of comments or observations. When we talk about what the perspectives of what happened because of the pandemic and because of the demand and also the threats. When we talk about what is coming from the pandemic, I'm asking myself, are they going to keep the demands if the pandemic passes? Because we don't know how long further along we will prolong and what measure the pandemic will be over. I have more the impression that we're going to have to live with the COVID in a higher, lower level. So therefore, I am resignating myself that many of the demands are going to be kept. So the costs associated to these demands are also going to be kept. The scenario of the post-pandemic is not going to be the same as the scenario pre-pandemic. And we will have to internalize the changes that we have seen in the last times. The second aspect has to do with the relevance of the container, how important the container is. Before, the people would go to the supermarket, they would take out the meat, the packaged meat, or if they were being attended at the stall, they would ask for it, they would put it in a bag, and there was not bigger elaboration in this. However, today, I think we need to be concerned about this. I'm talking as a first person for plural to talk about the retailers. We cannot continue giving this product the way we used to. Because for the customer, it's not the same thing to go to the sales store and they give you the product than when they receive it at their home. When they receive it in their home, the public seems to be more demanding. So therefore, we need to work with this aspect. How? I'm not quite sure yet. Maybe in a styrofoam box, because the bag that has juice, it's not very nice to look at. The customer does not want to receive a product in this condition. And since they did not buy it directly from the store, they would like to identify each product, and they don't have the knowledge that they had. So maybe the styrofoam box would have to have a labeling with the name of the product, etc. Here is a big issue that we need to address and to make a road. The third thing that concerns me, the opportunity or the threat that the discovery of some kind of relationship between eating meat and the virus. That is to say, what's going to happen if in some moment the news says that by eating meats will make you more propense to be affected by the virus. This is a threat. We need to be prepared. It could also be an opportunity. Maybe eating meat comparison to eating vegetables will make the person more resistant to the virus, or it prepares his organism to have a fast recovery. It also can be the interior of the meat basket. For instance, the beef is more beneficial for the organism than the pork or the poultry. I think it would be interesting to research this. And whatever happens, we need to be very, very attentive to be able to address this kind of scenario if it should occur. The second point has to do with the relationship of the price and demand at a short term. In this chart, that you can see the variation of the price of these three different categories of meat in the last year. You can see, as I said before, the beef, the imported meat, the variation is not so different, but the national is a 50% increase. In the case of the imported meat, is less, but it has also become more expensive. However, in the case of the pork chops, the relationship is negative. The variation is negative. In the case of the whole chicken, it's positive, but a whole lot less than what is increased in the beef. What I said before, this does not affect the sales of the meat, of the beef. I say that this is because of the amount of money that we have in the economy, because of what the money we were able to get from our retirement funds, etc. But this situation is not sustainable. It's not viable at a long term. At some moment, this will have to finish. And what I think that was going to happen, either the people will choose more the pork or the poultry. So that means that the beef will not be able to be so sustainable in its prices. And finally, when we talk about threats, this is something that concerns me. I'm glad that the previous speakers had talked about this, because not too long ago in a meeting with Carne, I mentioned this, and some of the farmers did not take it very serious. But today the problem is here to stay, and we need to be aware of this. I'm going to talk about 4 threats of the climate change, and the other is development of artificial meat, and the animals are being considered as feeling beings. And finally, I know that the previous speakers, Francisco, talked about the perspective of the offer of the production. I'm going to show it from the perspective of how the customer sees it. And sometimes these are very different. Not always, but many times, yes. What does the public see? They, for instance, see here is a title from the BBC. 50 million deaths due to the cold and the heat caused by the climate change. This is a current subject. And the people are concerned, and they have the right to do so. On the other hand, we have the United Nations making echo of this reality. This is a Twitter that the United Nations published. It said to eat less meat would help save water and would reduce the greenhouse gases which are causing the climate change. Is this true? Is it not true? It makes no importance at all. For the public, it's definitely true, the idea of what we are doing. It doesn't matter whether it has any substance in reality. There are 2 realities, what is outside of our mind and what is inside of our mind. The public finally takes purchases according to the reality that's in his mind, which might be very, very different of what is existing outside of his mind. This news appeared in May of this year. The president of Spain, I like to follow the news in Spain. That's why I took these head titles from this country. The president, Pedro Sanchez, obeys Bill Gates and the Davos agenda. The meat market will be intervened. Why? Because the Spanish president, where he's making echo of what we call the reset and the 2030 agenda of the United Nations, where they are asking the public to decrease the consuming of meat. The detail of this news says to be able to have these objectives, the president has presented his plan for Spain of 2015. The main measures that he has proposed goes from the change of what we are eating with less products from animal energy to prohibit the national flights. Today, this might look like very absurd, but very stupid. But a couple of years ago, it was very absurd. Many things that are part of our politically correct. And last week, the Minister of Spain, Alberto Gastón, published a Twitter saying that 14.5% of the gas, of the greenhouse gases come from the livestock. That means 15, to be able to have 1 kilogram of meat requires 15,000 liters of water. Obviously, the meat associations immediately were scandalized by this, and they were very prepared in Spain to answer this. So it was not very nice for them to say this. The newspaper in this country published this head title with this picture, that commenting as a form of questions, but it's like an affirmation. To reduce eating meat, according to the science, it says it's more healthy and sustainable. This is what the public is seeing. I insist. Maybe it doesn't have any scientific basis, but the public doesn't know. The people don't know. They don't know what is the true science. They just stay with this. It's more important, the newspaper headline, than an academic paper. So this doesn't amaze me of the development of artificial meat. This is the news of this year. The alternative proteins tripled in 2020. In comparison to last year, it multiplied by 3. The investments that were being made in the development of synthetic meat. This news comes from January of this year. The Spanish government has a farmed meat. The label. Chicken meat ethical. Beef meat ethical. Pork meat ethical. So what they're trying to do, they're trying to accuse us the other is not ethical. So therefore, the consumer who wants to feel good about himself and with everyone else and with the planet, and seeing this kind of label, obviously, he's receiving an impulse to leave aside the natural meat. The first manufacturing of synthetic meat promises 5,000 hamburgers a day. This is the news of June of last year. This is of this year, only a month ago. This was in Israel. This is something that's already here. The synthetic meat consuming does not have such a big commercial importance, but it's here. The third threat, considering the animals as feeling beings. We published this. This was published. I did not read anything of this French writer, Franz Olivier Gisbert, but I understand that he's very well known. And he published a book saying that an animal is a person. I have not read the book, but I can imagine what it's saying and where it's going. And I found an article, an academic article, that is based on what this book is saying. And here, in the summary, the author of this says that the conclusion is that they're not the same. They're not people, but they're not the same as the rest of the things that are not people. And they have feelings, and this has ethical implications and judicial implications, not implications for the animals, but for us. We are obligated, moral obligations and legal obligations when we talk about the animals. And finally, that it's not admissible to cause pain or death to an animal without a justification. And who says that this is not a justification? I guess the law would have to say it at some moment, so we need to be careful of the regulations that's coming to us. This news I found in the website of the previous date before the plebiscite. Should we include the animals in the Constitution? I don't have the news here, but there was a 60%, if I don't agree, of the candidates as constituents agree, including a reference of the Constitution to the animal rights. So therefore, we have to be very attentive. I'm not saying that they're going to prohibit us from eating from animal protein, but what's probable is that we're going to have new regulations and demands. And finally, after all of this, obviously that there is agendas of political correctness contrary to the production of meat production. The veganism has now become, the animalism has become similar to the human rights. Here we have this example of Joaquin Phoenix. He's not an unknown actor, but he has to be able to be more famous. He has it against the meat production. And here I found a questionnaire from December of 2018, which is very close to the present date that I could find. And according to this, 23% of the Chilean are not eating meat anymore. They considered this gives a 4.4 million people between vegans and vegetarians. 23%, 4.4 million people in Chile are not eating meat, maybe because of a feeding habit, but because of ethical reasons. And this, to me, is what concerns me the most. And here I'm going to leave my presentation. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I will be at your disposal. Thank you so much, Gastón, for your participation. And your experience, or the way that you've been able to analyze the situation which has been written in this presentation. What do you think would be feasible to generate throughout the supply chain to be able to mitigate these effects that these would have on the production of animals and meat around the world? It's necessary to communicate to the public all of the efforts that you are doing, for instance, for the animal welfare, for mitigating the adverse effects of the livestock, of the climate change. Francisco said something very interesting, but the common people don't know this. So if they don't know it, it doesn't exist. It simply doesn't exist. And that's just as simple as it is. So it's not enough to know many things, but we have to communicate this and communicate it in a very efficient way. It makes sense. The activists who are against this, to the animal production, they have been a whole lot more awake than we are, and they have been a whole lot more slyer than we are. We have the advantage that we have solid scientific arguments to back us up. But something that we have not done is to do an efforts of communicating this. And I think that this is a challenge that we need to face as an industry, as strategic as possible, hopefully with being a whole lot more astute than the others. So the conclusion would be to diffuse a strategic diffusion of this that make up strengths to be able to let the people know that not everything that are being said on the, we need to consider that in the case of the cattle, the conditions are ideal. You can visit a livestock farm and you can see the individuals pasturing, clean air, and with a very good scenery. How many humans live in this? But we don't show this aspect. Thank you so much. Very interesting. We want to thank you so much to Don Gastón Escudero for his presentation, which is a very interesting point of view of the contingency that we have here in Chile. And together we're saying goodbye to our speaker. We're going to separate 2 minutes because we're going to have the National Director